Before the election of 2010, state governments all over the country were fairly evenly controlled by Republicans and Democrats. But the Republican Party launched a state government takeover that changed the entire political landscape. And since they took control, Republicans have been laser focused on their top priority, attacking the labor movement. All over the country, they have passed laws lowering wages, lifting restrictions on child labor, repealing or restricting occupational workplace and safety laws, and of course, repealing laws protecting the right to organize labor unions and bargain collectively. 100 years ago, the Republican Party used a very familiar playbook. In the 50 years between the Civil War and the Great Depression, the Supreme Court was controlled by a conservative majority. The most conservative justices were known as the Four Horsemen, a reference to the apocalyptic symbols of death, famine, war, and conquest. During that time, the United States Supreme Court struck down more than 200 state and federal laws that protected working people. The laws overturned by the Supreme Court were a familiar list: minimum wage, child labor laws, occupational workplace safety and health laws, and of course laws protecting the right to organize labor unions and bargain collectively. By the 1930s, the Supreme Court had decimated any hope of legislation that protected working people. But in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the 32nd President of the United States and quickly ushered in the New Deal, which would eventually include Social Security for the elderly, investments in infrastructure to get people back to work, and federal insurance to guarantee that people who saved money wouldn't lose everything when the bank went under. The Four Horsemen on the Supreme Court threatened to overturn the entire New Deal, until one conservative justice, Owen Roberts, switched his vote and upheld a minimum wage law from the state of Washington. 2 weeks later, Justice Roberts voted to uphold the National Labor Relations Act, and a couple weeks after that, to uphold Social Security. We may never know why Justice Roberts had a change of heart, but we know this. In 1937, one justice made the difference in a decision to uphold the National Labor Relations Act, the law that guarantees the basic right of private sector employees to organize trade unions and engage in collective bargaining. One justice. One justice changed the 50-year tide of a Supreme Court that overturned more than 200 laws protecting working people. One Supreme Court justice changed history when he said that workers do have rights. 80 years later, in January of this year, the Supreme Court's conservative majority seemed ready to say that public sector union dues violated the First Amendment. 1 month later, Justice Antonin Scalia died unexpectedly, and it's the only reason we don't have national right to work for public sector unions. The only reason. There are now 8 justices on the Supreme Court instead of 9 because a Republican-led Senate has pledged to block President Obama from nominating Scalia's replacement, and 2 of the remaining 8 justices are in their 80s. In 1937, the modern labor movement was born because of one Supreme Court decision and one Supreme Court justice. 80 years later, the modern labor movement is again in the hands of one Supreme Court decision and one Supreme Court nomination. The next president will nominate at least 3 Supreme Court justices and set the direction of the labor movement for the next 50 years. And now, that decision will be made on November 8th. Every state in this country controlled by Republicans has seen a death by 1,000 cuts to the labor movement since 2010, and the only reason they didn't cut us once in the heart to get it over with is because they couldn't. They didn't have the power yet. On November 8th, that's the power they want. Over the last 100 years, the labor movement has experienced many significant moments, many turning points where it could have gone one direction or another. And the people inside the labor movement had to do difficult things, make difficult decisions, and make huge sacrifices that included losing their lives to keep this labor movement for their children. This is our moment in history. And all of this boils down to a very simple choice: who will stand up and help this labor movement grow, and who would destroy it? In a historical moment, there is no room for apathy and indecision. The only difference between a world with a labor movement and a world without it is how hard we work until November the 8th. Brothers and sisters, let's go win this.